Hi, I'm Transtina, and I want to talk about Wicked. This video contains spoilers for the novel Wicked, The Life and Times of the Wicked Witch of the West by Gregory Maguire, and the films Wicked and Wicked for Good. I haven't seen Wicked the musical, but presumably I'll spoil that too. There's this cultural fascination, I think, with fairy tales, the parables we use to teach our children. The stories we tell reveal a lot about us, and the stories we tell our children expose the values that we want to persist through time. I think that this is the reason for our interest in retelling fairy tales, a re-examination of the values that we pass down. As you might have guessed by the topic of this video, the story in question today is The Wizard of Oz. This isn't exactly a fairy tale, per se, but I think it's fair to say that it has a similar cultural status. The type of storytelling is similar. It's a simple, dreamlike story that doesn't necessarily make a lot of sense when examined as a rational adult, but it does follow the logic of childhood. More than that, though, it has stuck itself in our cultural unconscious, shaping so much of the way that we think without us even realizing it. For example, think about the connotations of the term flying monkey, or man behind the curtain. Because of that, I don't think it's too surprising that it has been the subject of, to be frank, too many adaptations and retellings. The question is, what values does it impart? Do we want to pass those values on? The first of these retellings, and, in my opinion, the best, is the novel by Gregory Maguire. Relatively recently, my book club, yes I have friends, decided to read it at the suggestion of my partner. A lot of people, I think, try to go back and read the book after enjoying the musical, or, more recently, the films, and bounce off of it hard. If you're one of those people, this video definitely isn't meant to attack you. It is a very different story, even if the broad strokes of the plots are similar. This video also isn't intended as a comparison between the films and the book, but there are a few places where I will highlight the changes made where I think they're interesting. I know the films are an adaptation of the musical, not the books, but like I said, I haven't seen the musical, so forgive me if I criticize the films for something that was taken from the musical. I will have some criticisms of the films, but that's just my opinion, and I don't mean to say that you have to feel the same way as me. I hope, however, that you'll hear me out on it. Now, this is not the first time I had tried to read this book. I had tried to read it when I was 10 or so, after being in my elementary school's production of The Wizard of Oz. I was an extra, and I probably should not have read it. Luckily though, I didn't finish the book and didn't remember any of it, so I was able to go back to it with fresh eyes. I have to say, I was very surprised by what I found. I was expecting to like it, to be honest, but I was not expecting it to resonate with me and affect me the way that it did, so I decided to make this video to explore all of that. Before we get started though, shout out to my partner in my book club. Y'all are the best, and I am probably using some of your ideas in this video. It is very easy to read allegories into this novel. In fact, most of this video is going to be me doing just that, but I think it's important to recognize that there aren't really any one-to-one allegories between real life and the situations presented here. I will discuss similarities and resonances where they exist, but nothing is going to be a perfect match, and I think that's at least partially the intention. Also, there are many different ways to interpret the story. I am going to give one possible interpretation that resonated with me, but I'm certainly not saying that this is the only way to interpret this story, and I do not mean to invalidate a different interpretation if it resonates more with you. Unsurprisingly, the interpretation that I found the most meaningful is reading Elphaba, the main character of the novel and titular Wicked Witch of the West, as transfeminine. Starting from the prologue, in a flash-forward sequence, we see Dorothy and her party theorizing that Elphaba is either a lesbian or a hermaphrodite. Now, the word hermaphrodite is an interesting one and has been used in a few different ways. In its most direct usage, it is a derogatory term used to refer to a certain kind of intersex people. In fact, I think we are intended to interpret Elphaba as intersex. When she is born, people are unable to determine what genitals she has, and references are made to something being removed before she is assigned female, which lines up exactly with the way intersex babies are non-consensually subjected to surgery to force their bodies to align with one of the sexes that patriarchy allows. Also, when Fiyero later sees her naked, he notices a scar near her genitals. That being said, the term hermaphrodite is definitely also used to demonize trans femmes. At the end of the day, the fear being expressed here is of women with penises or of men who became women, and it is impossible to avoid the transmisogynistic connotations of that. I don't want to take away intersex representation, I know there is precious little of that already, but I hope you will forgive me reading Elphaba as transfeminine, as I still found her story very resonant with the transfeminine experience. This is a complicated novel with many themes, but I want to start by discussing the theme of guilt. We will see this come up again and again throughout Elphaba's life, and I want to connect this with the transfeminine experience. One of the first and central observations of transfeminist writing is to notice that we are systematically used as scapegoats by any communities that we find ourselves in, including trans communities. Traditionally, the spiritual purpose of a scapegoat was to be imbued with the sins of the community and ritually sacrificed, cleansing the community of their sins. We see this pattern play out time and time again with transfemmes, from conservative child abusers accusing us of being predators, deflecting accusations against them, to progressives and leftists accusing us of having insufficient solidarity with the Palestinian struggle, making us an outlet for the feeling of helplessness that so many of us have about the ongoing genocide, just to name 2 examples. We will see this play out with Elphaba over and over, and each time I felt it like a dagger through my heart. Section 1. Something wicked, this way comes. To understand Elphaba, you need to start by understanding her parents. They are both pieces of work, each of them carrying their own guilt. Her mother, Milena Throp, is the heir to the noble Throp family of Munchkinland, the eastern region of Oz. In fact, the Throp family is the most powerful noble family in Munchkinland. She has, however, married a preacher named Frexbar, or just Frex for short, and she has found herself unsatisfied with the modest life that he insists on living. More than that, she feels neglected in their relationship, as Frex is completely devoted to his work, and will always choose his spiritual calling over his family. Because of this, she is a serial adulterer, and, in fact, Elphaba's biological father is one of her affairs, later revealed to be the Wizard of Oz himself. There's an interesting bit of nuance here, however. On many of the occasions where she would sleep with someone, she would intentionally become, let's say, chemically enhanced, which raises many questions about consent. In general, though, I think it's fair to say that she did give consent anyway, as she ingested the substances with the express intent of sleeping with someone, and she doesn't seem particularly regretful about it. This is muddled a bit with the wizard, though, as he gave her some sort of a drink before they slept together, and she doesn't remember it well. It is implied, though never confirmed, that this drink is the reason why Elphaba has green skin. Because of this, Milena views her as both a manifestation of her guilt and a punishment for her sins. On the night of Elphaba's birth, a traveling show called The Clock of the Time Dragon has come to the town where Milena and Frex live. There are a few different religions practiced in Oz. The most common is Unionism, a religion that worships an unnamed god. In many ways, this religion is similar to Christianity, though there isn't an equivalent to Jesus, worshipping a single, distinctly masculine god that is both all-knowing and all-powerful. It isn't exactly the same as Christianity, of course, but it does share the belief that the religion needs to be spread, that non-believers need to be converted. Another common religion is the pleasure faith, which is centered around the deity the Time Dragon and the Clock of the Time Dragon as a physical object of worship. As the name might suggest, the pleasure faith is a religion that takes hedonism to an extremely toxic level, promoting pleasure at all costs. This is in stark contrast to the reverence for modesty found in Unionism, so Frex is horrified at the possibility of the pleasure faith spreading to his town, and goes to protest and preach against it. The day of Elphaba's birth, as the clock is approaching, he makes a comment about the devil arriving, which Milena remarks is not a great thing to say on the day your daughter is expected to be born. Beyond that, not only does he abandon his wife while she's giving birth to preach against the clock, he fails to meaningfully change anything, and he views Elphaba's existence as a punishment for his failure. So, before she is even born, Elphaba has the guilt of both of her parents projected onto her, which, to understate things a little, is a bad way to start out. Throughout her childhood, Elphaba deals with the resentment of her parents, a resentment that she has no way of understanding. As she gets a little older, she starts to be integrated with the other children in the village, and she is mercilessly bullied for the color of her skin. This has obvious parallels with the experience of racialized children in majority white communities, but I want to highlight the similarities to the trans feminine experience. Many people assume that, before we transition, we are treated as the gender that we are assigned at birth, but it really is more complicated than that. I don't want to speak for anyone else, but I can certainly say that I have been a trans woman for my whole life, and, on some level, I knew it as a child. I might not have known the words for it, but I knew on a level that is deeper than words what I was. I would, of course, have this knowledge repressed in me as I grew up, but it never disappeared. More importantly than that, however, is that the people around me could, on some level, sense it as well. Even if the kids who relentlessly bullied me or the small group of girls who mostly accepted me didn't know the name trans woman, they knew what it meant to be trans feminine, even if it was on a level deeper than words. So, this really resonated with me, because I know what it's like to be treated as something else, as something lower. Section 2. Entering the world. I think that many of us spend our childhoods sheltered, in some sense. That's not to say that we have an easy childhood, but I think that many of us are somewhat insulated from the rest of the world. Even if we have some abstract knowledge of the world around us, I knew there was a war in Afghanistan throughout my childhood, for example, we don't necessarily have the context to understand what that means. As we start to get older, though, that changes. For many of us, certainly for me, that change usually starts to happen as we attend college or university, as we start to broaden our horizons and learn more about the world we live in. For Elphaba, as a young adult, she attends Shiz University. I seriously can't believe it's called that. A university for learning magic. While there, she is exposed to many of the realities of the world as she meets her first real friends. Her first friend is her roommate, Galinda, a wealthy social climber. To be honest, I don't have too much to say about her, but I do think it's worth mentioning that, for those of you who are familiar with the musical and/or the movies, but not the novel, you will probably be surprised by the fact that they really don't end up being that close. They certainly don't end up forming a quasi-sisterhood in the way that they do in the adaptations. I think the novel portrays Galinda much less charitably, but also much more sympathetically. In the films, the sense I got a lot of the time was that Galinda was just kind of stupid. The second film is a little bit better about this than the first, but even still, she doesn't seem to understand a lot of things. I'm not opposed to this, many of us can serve systems and ideologies without intending to, but the depiction of the novel is just different, as she does seem to understand exactly what she is doing, and is making a conscious choice to serve power rather than to fight it. The second friend I want to discuss is actually two friends, Crope and Timid. These are classmates of Elphaba's at Shiz, and it is extremely obvious that they are in a gay relationship. I don't have much to say about them yet, other than to say how annoyed I am that they are completely cut out of the musical and films. If you are only familiar with the films or musical, you might be surprised to hear me say this, but the adaptations completely strip out all the queerness from the story. I know lots of people say that Elphaba and Galinda are gay, but I'm sorry, but they aren't. If you want to interpret them that way, that's fine, I'm hardly one to judge, but that definitely isn't textually supported in the slightest. I do get it though. We are so starved for mainstream lesbian representation, so we take what we can get. Also, if you're the kind of person who disagrees strongly with that statement, I just want to ask, do we have a lot of lesbian representation? Or do we have a lot of lesbian porn? Anyway, this is one of the things that I genuinely dislike about the movies. There is so much queerness in the book, and it is completely gone. Actually, I'm going to take a second and list a few examples. First, later in the book, there are references made to TikTok creatures, I'm getting there, with indeterminate and incomplete genders. Second, while Elphaba is a toddler, her parents are textually in a throuple. Well, they're cheating on each other with the same person, which must be the weirdest experience for that guy, but I'm calling it close enough. Third, there's actually a line later on where Galinda comments that sharing a bed with Elphaba while they were traveling made her feel something special, meaning that there is more textual support for their relationship in the book than there is in the movies. Anyway, thanks for indulging me, that's just something that bothers me. Next, I want to talk about Fiyero Tigalar, the chieftain of the Arjiki Nation. The western area of Oz is called the Vinkus, and the people who live there are pejoratively called Winkies. though there are actually many different nations and groups that live in the Vinkus, including the Arjikis. At this point, Oz is in a state of imperial expansion and calcification. The wizard rules in the Emerald City, and he is trying, throughout the book, to expand his power and influence. The Yellow Brick Road, of course, is a project of both, as transportation infrastructure allows soldiers to more efficiently be moved to both expand the territories of the Empire and to enforce control in the existing territories of the Empire. Expansion, however, is primarily taking place in the Vinkus and in Quadling country to the south. Any project like this, however, requires labor, and there is one tried and true way that empires always produce laborers. In Oz, there are two racialized groups that are being exploited for their labor. First are the TikTok creatures, which are basically robots and are viewed as non-sentient. It is actually not super clear throughout the book if they are sentient or not, but I think there are two main pieces of evidence that they are. First, as I mentioned before, they understand the concept of gender and are able to play with the performance of gender. Second, at the end of the book, a reference is made to a freed TikTok creature educating others on the concept of class revolution, something that I think requires sentience. The second are the animals. In Oz, there are capital A animals, which are definitely sentient, and lowercase a animals, which are, as far as anyone can tell, not. The Empire, though, wants to make use of the animals for their labor power, and the idea is being pushed that they should go back to the fields and stop talking, reverting to a non-sentient state. We actually see this happen, as some animals seem to lose their sentience. Further, laws are being enacted that are slowly enforcing segregation between humans and animals. This brings us to the final friend. Dr. Dillamond is a goat and a professor at Shiz University. He is subject to persecution due to the aforementioned prejudice being stoked, but also because of his research. He is researching the difference between animals, and humans, with the goal of proving that there is no difference between animals and humans. The motivation here is clear, as this would allow him to prove that there is no scientific basis for segregation. This is, of course, a threat to the Empire, though we all know that they would just ignore that research if he finished it anyway, since that's what happened in the real world. Elphaba, Galinda, Croak, Tibbet, Fiyero, and others not worth mentioning start working with Dillamond on his research. For this, Dillamond is murdered by Grommatic, a TikTok creature serving Madame Morrible, a high-ranking professor at Shiz that seeks out talented magicians to be groomed into service of the wizard. This, of course, enrages Elphaba, and it leads her to take action. Section 3. Saving the World. In the wake of Dillamond's death, Elphaba and Galinda, who changes her name to Galinda to honor Dillamond since he struggled to pronounce her name, travel to the Emerald City to speak with the wizard. Their goal is to present Dillamond's research, as they believe that having evidence of the law's irrationality would convince him to change it. This is, of course, naive, but I think it's a belief that many of us have to grow out of. Unsurprisingly, the wizard is not receptive to their pleas and sends them on their way. Here, we see their paths diverge. Glinda more or less drops the matter and goes back to her old life at Shiz. Elphaba, on the other hand, stays in the Emerald City to continue fighting, disappearing from her old life. She remains there for 5 years, joining a group of rebels planning more extreme action against the wizard's regime. Interestingly, we never find out much about the rebels. In fact, we never see or hear from any of them throughout the novel. We can, however, infer a few things. The first is that they are falling victim to a common misconception, and that their primary goal seems to be assassinating the wizard. This, of course, will not work. To paraphrase the YouTuber Sophie from Mars, fascism cannot be stopped by defeating a guy in a room somewhere. There's too much of a structure supporting the figurehead to disappear in the wake of the figurehead's death. Elphaba, however, plays an extremely small part in this plan. It is not made clear exactly how the plan will work, but she is supposed to assassinate Madame Morrible, her former teacher. This is complicated, however, when she reconnects with Fiyero, the two of them forming some sort of romantic relationship. It is mostly sexual, as Elphaba is in hiding in preparation for the assassinations, but they definitely do seem to have romantic feelings for each other beyond just the sexual. In any case, it is the first romantic experience that Elphaba ever has, and it will turn out to be her last, so it becomes an increasingly core part of her experience. When the day of reckoning comes and the plan is carried out, Elphaba fails to kill Morrible, and Fiyero is murdered by the wizard's secret police for his association with Elphaba. This leaves Elphaba in a state of shock, and she goes to a Monterey to become a Naunt, which is basically a nun. She remains in a borderline comatose state for a year, before recovering to consciousness and remaining there for many more years. Of note here is the fact that this is the first time we actually get the story from Elphaba's perspective. Up to this point, we have seen her through the eyes of those in her life. The switch, to me, highlights the fact that this is the most important part of her life, but it will take a little bit of explaining to understand why. Before that, though, I want to talk about the second and final thing that we learn about the rebels, which is that we never hear anything about them again. There are a lot of ways to interpret this. Maybe they all got captured, maybe they all fled the city, or some combination of these, but the interpretation that resonates with me the most is that the rebels simply abandoned Elphaba. Now, to be fair, Elphaba also abandons the rebels, but I kind of understand that since she feels guilty about fumbling a crucial part of the plan. If we believe that the rebels abandoned her, however, that means that they were not able to forgive her for making this mistake. Through the lens of my transfem reading, this is a pattern that repeats all too often, which transfeminist writers call transfem disposability. The pattern of transfems being held to a higher standard than non-transfems and being exiled from communities over relatively minor infractions. I think that, even when the infraction is larger, transfems are punished in ways that other groups would not be. For example, I strongly disagree with the Reddit post that ContraPoints wrote about Palestine, but let's not pretend that a non-transfem saying something like this would have been subject to the same level of scrutiny, discussion, and abandonment that she was. Now hold on, you might be saying. She still has a large following, surely she wasn't cancelled that badly. And yeah, I don't disagree, but it is undeniable that she has been systematically and repeatedly exiled from all online, and presumably in-person, trans communities over the years, which is a textbook example of transfem disposability. And, as noted in the essay Hot Allostatic Load by Porpentine, follower count does not necessarily translate to community. Also, this essay is a mandatory read for non-trans femmes. Sorry, I don't make the rules. Anyway, in Elphaba's case, I have a hard time believing that others would be abandoned for failing at a mission like this. If they would be, then the revolutionary organization was never going to last anyway. Not that this doesn't happen in real life, and I have a hard time believing that they would even have gotten this far. Like I said though, there are many ways of reading this. I just resonate with this one due to my experiences in progressive communities. Section 4. The Broom. In the biblical story of creation, all of humanity is descended from a man, Adam, and his wife, Eve. In some tellings, though, there is a third of these initial humans, Lilith, Adam's first wife, who was cast out of the Garden of Eden for being disobedient to Adam. Now, I just want to say that I'm going to reference the black paper Gender Accelerationism by Nick Sland when talking about this. I don't necessarily agree with or endorse everything that's in this paper, but there are parts of it that I like, and I'm extracting those parts where I think they are relevant. So, please don't cancel me for something someone else said, okay? In any case, this paper uses this story as a metaphor for discussing the dynamics of patriarchy. There's the man, Adam, the obedient woman, Eve, and the disobedient woman, Lilith. This has been criticized, but the criticisms of this metaphor mostly just boil down to not all men. And I'm sorry, but yes, all men. Fiyero and Elphaba seem to have a fairly healthy relationship, mostly unaffected by patriarchal dynamics, but not completely. Their relationship begins with Fiyero following Elphaba, even when she tries to express to him that she doesn't want to be followed. I don't mean to doubt their relationship, I genuinely do believe that they love each other, but even this relationship does not completely escape the violations of consent that are built into patriarchy. More than this, though, something that I have left out till now is the fact that, at this time, Fiyero was married. In fact, he was subject to an arranged marriage when he was a child, and his wife, Sarima, and her children are waiting for him at home in the Venkus. Throughout the entire period of his relationship with Elphaba, he is expecting Sarima to remain at home performing the reproductive labor of raising their children. So unfortunately, yes, even men that are marginalized in some other way. even men who seem to be better. All men are capable of wielding patriarchal power, and do so without realizing it unless they make the active decision not to. If this upsets you, consider the following statement. All white people are capable of wielding white supremacist power, and do so without realizing it unless they make the active decision not to. If you are bothered by one of these statements and not the other, that is perhaps something that is worth reflecting on. Also, if both statements upset you, I suspect you aren't going to like most of my videos. Anyway, this trichotomy is, to me, central to understanding Wiccan. To start, let's look at the deities in Oz. I will ignore the Time Dragon because the character of its divinity is somehow different to the others. Followers of the Pleasure Faith tend to believe that all of Oz exists within a dream of the Time Dragon, whereas followers of the other faiths believe that their deities have deliberate effects on the world. Now, I have already mentioned the unnamed god, and this is our Adam figure, the dominant masculine. Next, we have Lurleen. Not much is known about her, but the two facts that we do know are illuminating. First, one of the central beliefs about her is that she is the one who gave sentience to the animals, something that reads to me as very similar to giving birth. Giving life, you get it. Second, she is also believed to be the progenitor of the royal bloodline that the wizard overthrew, so her primary influence on the world is as a mother. Because of this, I think it is fair to place her as our Eve figure. Finally, for our Lilith, we have the Cumbric Witch, believed to be the source of all evil in the world. I think the parallels to Lilith as the mother of demons are somewhat obvious here. Eve embodies the patriarchal definition of womanhood, at the core of which is the ability to give birth. This is extended, however, in two key ways. First, women are expected to be sexually available to men, and second, women are expected to perform reproductive labor, or domestic labor if you prefer that term. As Nick's Land points out, trans femmes are unable to give birth, leaving us categorically restricted from being Eved and forced into being Lilith. In response to this, some trans femmes play up their sexual availability and reproductive labor in a desperate attempt to be allowed as Eve. This, I think, is similar to the reason why Elphaba becomes a Mont. She has failed at being Lilith, and it has gotten the only person she really cares about killed, so she has thrown herself wholeheartedly into being Eve. There are certainly a few different aspects to life as a nun, but it is undeniable that a big part of it is just reproductive labor. And, in Elphaba's case, it is all reproductive labor. While at the Monterey, Elphaba ends up caring for Tibbet, who has fallen ill. The novel does not clarify, but it is pretty obvious that he has AIDS, and yet another instance of the adaptation stripping out all of the queer stories. She is able to help ease his suffering, but she is not able to save his life. This is the catalyst that shocks her back to reality. All she is doing now is punishing herself, forcing herself to work harder and harder to try to be accepted into a role that she can never truly fit. In the end, some of us are destined to be Lilith. To continue her own life, she decides to travel to Kiamo-Ko, the castle of the Arjikis, where she can find Sarima and apologize for Fiero's death. Before departing, however, she talks with one Mother Yakel, who I'm sure isn't important, and Yakel tells her to bring Lear, a young boy that has been living at the Monterey. Unbeknownst to Elphaba and Lear, but known to Yakel, Lear is the child of Fiero and Elphaba, who gave birth to him while functionally unconscious. Admittedly, this throws a bit of a wrench into my trans femme reading, since she can give birth, but she categorically rejects her prescribed role as a mother to Lear, so I think it still works. This, of course, has a deep impact on Lear, but that is much more relevant in the second novel, of which he is the protagonist, so I will not discuss it in any depth here. Yakel also gives Elphaba a broom, which she will later discover is enchanted. I know there are historical reasons why witches are depicted as riding brooms, but I have always found the symbol of it fascinating. A broom, of course, is a tool of domestic labor and can be viewed as a symbol of feminine submission. So, to repurpose it as a weapon of rebellion is incredibly powerful. Section 5. The Witches. Elphaba traveled west to Kiamo-Ko in search of forgiveness, but she would not find it. There, she meets Sarima and her children, Lear's half-siblings, but Sarima refuses to hear Elphaba's story. She does, however, welcome Elphaba and Lear to stay, and Kiamo Ko becomes something resembling a home to them. While here, she discovers the Grimoire, a book of magic which is, incidentally, the reason the wizard came to Oz in the first place. She studies it, beginning to expand her magical abilities, and continues Dilliman's research into the differences between humans, animals, and animals. As part of this, she creates the flying monkeys, who she attempts to teach to speak. She will eventually be successful, though she won't actually be there to observe it. Now, I think that this is actually extremely transfemme-coded, but it's a little bit hard to explain why. In a nutshell, though, I think that transfemmes are tinkerers, which I think is because so many of us feel an affinity for machines in a way that I haven't seen from other groups. To understand why, gender accelerationism contains a discussion of the Turing test, a theoretical test to determine if a machine is sentient, developed by the computer scientist and mathematician Alan Turing. The way the test works, basically, is that a machine is said to be sentient if a human conversing with the machine can't tell if it's a machine or another human. Now, in the age of ChatGPT, it has become depressingly clear that this is not actually a good way to gauge machine sentience. It does, however, make a certain amount of emotional sense. As Nix discusses, Alan Turing was a gay man, which was, at the time, a transfeminized identity, since cis people didn't really know the difference between transfemmes and cis gay men. This isn't really the case now, or at least not so much, but it certainly was then, so it isn't hard to imagine Turing feeling a connection to the idea of a machine constantly struggling to prove that it is alive to a humanity that won't believe it. Nix argues that this is the reason why so many transfemmes are programmers, and I think she's right. In my own anecdotal experience, I see transfemmes, more than any other group, identifying with computers and robots and dolls. And I really think this is why. We know that we aren't really people, we're just approximating it as best as we can. Obviously, we aren't the only marginalized group to experience this, but I do think we're the only marginalized group to express it in this way. Now, returning to Elphaba, she obviously isn't a programmer, nor is she tinkering with machines, but I do not think her study of magic is actually so different. After all, aren't programmers and chip designers and so on viewed as the magicians of our day? I see people make jokes to that effect all the time, and I really do think that it is something in our collective subconscious, as much as such a thing exists, and it really does seem that Elphaba has more of an affinity for magic, for animals, than she does for any other people, lining up really well with the transfemme experience I just described. Furthermore, both of these fall nicely into the legacy of Lilith as the mother of demons, as we are all crafting inhuman monsters more akin to us than to humanity. This leaves Elphaba practicing magic in a castle to the west, but before she truly becomes the Wicked Witch of the West, we need to turn our attention east to Elphaba's younger sister, Nessa Rose, or Nessa for short. In the novel, she was born without arms, though the musical and films changed the nature of her disability, likely due to casting difficulties. Because of this, and Elphaba's, well, everything, Nessa was the favored child of their parents, and especially of Frex, as Meleda died giving birth to her third child, who I won't discuss at all in this video. Here, we see the trichotomy emerging again. Frex, the Adam, Nessa, the Eve, and Elphaba, the Lilith. With Frex paying close attention to her, Nessa would grow up to become extremely religious. Now, as you may recall, the Throp family is the most powerful noble family in Munchkinland. As the eldest child, Elphaba is the heir, but with her missing, this falls to Nessa. Eventually, she is able to use this position to declare independence from the Emerald City, founding the Free State of Munchkinland as its leader. She does not, however, use this as an opportunity to fix the problems with the wizard's regime. Instead, she continues expanding the power of the Unionist religion and continues restricting the rights of animals. This is depressingly common. It is relatively easy to break away from a bad system, but to continue enacting parts of it. Eventually, Elphaba returns to Munchkinland to visit Nessa and Frex. While there, Frex suggests that Elphaba is the rightful heir and should stay and rule Munchkinland instead of Nessa. Elphaba, however, refuses. she and Frex both understand what Nessa doesn't. The woman figurehead is going to be blamed for any problems in the society. Because, of course, Nessa isn't really doing anything new here, she is just continuing the patterns that already existed. Frex, then, favoring Nessa, wants Elphaba to be the scapegoat. I don't think I need to re-explain the transfem reading here. This is textbook scapegoating. I mean, while thinking about this, Elphaba literally says that she won't be Frex's whipping girl, so what else am I supposed to think? Anyway, eventually, most transfems get sick of all this and leave their old communities behind, which is, by the way, why transfem separatism is so popular. I am not a transfem separatist myself, but I certainly understand why some of us are. In any case, where Lilith was cast out of Eden, Elphaba leaves of her own free will, but in both cases, this leaves society without a scapegoat. So, what happens next? Well, Eve becomes the scapegoat, holding the original sin of humanity, the same way that Nessa is held personally responsible for all the atrocities committed in Munchkinland, being ordained as the Wicked Witch of the East. Returning to Kiamo-ko, Elphaba finds that all of Fiero's family has been kidnapped by the wizard, leaving only her and Lear, and Elphaba's old nanny, who I don't really have space to talk about here, in Kiamo-ko, with the people of the Vinkus rallying around her as a figure of resistance against the wizard's imperial expansion. So, in parallel to Nessa, Elphaba is ordained as the Wicked Witch of the West, and the two of them flank as feminine resistors to the wizard's masculine dominance. Yet another instance of our gender trichotomy. Because, of course, the fact that Eve is obedient does not mean that she is loyal. Adam has led her close, leaving her in the perfect position to slip a knife in his back while he watches Lilith. He just needs to push too far. The Wicked Witches, though, do not exist by accident. This scenario was very specifically constructed, and the architect of that construction is Yakel. Or, at least, since not much is revealed about her in this book, she is an instrument of the architect, as it is entirely possible that she did not know what she was doing. As we have already discussed, she gave Elphaba the broom, her tool of rebellion. But before that, she gave Milena, the witch's mother, a medicine intended to stop her second child from being green. Instead, however, this medicine is what caused Nessa to be born without arms, which is a large contributor to why her life turned out the way it did. Now, like I said, Yakel's motivations aren't really explored in this book, but we don't need them. What we can say for certain is that she is acting in the legacy of Lilith, passed from the Cumbric Witch to Yakel to Elphaba. Further, she helps to ensure that Nessa will be driven to rebellion, rather than remaining docile, as we see in characters like Morrible or Glinda, who have been given just enough power and privilege that they are willing to accept their own oppression. It is sometimes easy to forget, but this is, after all, a retelling of The Wizard of Oz, so there is really only one way this can end. The rebellion is destined to inevitably use up and consume the witches. The first to die is Nessa, crushed by Dorothy's house. Her death has broader consequences, though, since she was the ruler of Munchkinland. When she was at Shiz, she was gifted a pair of silver slippers by her parents, a symbol to Elphaba of her father's favoritism. Later, Glinda would enchant the slippers so that they gave Nessa the ability to walk without aid, and they would become a symbol of her divine authority over Munchkinland, as she was dressing up her magic as miracles. When Elphaba visited her, she promised the slippers to Elphaba when she died. However, Glinda gave the slippers to Dorothy to take to the wizard. In the films, there didn't really seem to be any logic to why she did this, but in the book, it was a calculated move. As a symbol of dominion over Munchkinland, delivering them to the wizard would allow him to reclaim Munchkinland and avert a civil war. Elphaba, however, was outraged that Glinda had given away her only memento of her sister. For her part, Dorothy traveled to meet the wizard as instructed, but found that she was unable to remove the slippers. It is never clarified why, though I like to believe that it is Glinda's final act of rebellion. As payment for sending her home, then, the wizard instructed Dorothy to kill Elphaba, so Dorothy traveled to Kiamo-ko. She didn't want to kill Elphaba, though. She had learned that she was responsible for the death of Nessa and was coming to apologize and ask for forgiveness. This enrages Elphaba further. She has lived her whole life in guilt. Guilt over being alive, guilt over failing to kill Morrible, and guilt over Fiero's death, and she was denied forgiveness for any of it. So how dare Dorothy come to her after killing her sister and ask for forgiveness? In her emotionally heightened state, careless, she would allow her clothes to catch fire, and Dorothy would attempt to put out the fire with a bucket of water, to which Elphaba was horribly allergic, resulting in her death. In the moment of her death, however, Elphaba felt, for the first time in her life, a lifting of her guilt. Finally, she could be forgiven, or, at least, she could stop being punished. In death, Dorothy cleansed her of guilt, a final and total baptism. And really, I think Elphaba had internalized her guilt so totally that she could never view anything short of death as sufficient punishment. Section 6. Conclusion. Like I said at the start, I don't intend this as an attack on anyone who prefers the musical or films to the book, but there is one sentiment that bothers me. I have seen people express something like, I like movie Elphaba more than book Elphaba. And to some extent I get that. To be blunt, Elphaba can be a bit of a bitch in the book, like just nasty. But I don't think that this is necessarily what people are talking about. No, I think that there are two main flaws that people are referring to. First, the way she treats Lear, refusing to care for him. However, I think that this is, on some level, her right, and the fact that we expect people, usually mothers, to care for their children without any help and despite any other circumstances in their lives is a massive problem with our society. So, yeah, I think she could have cared more for him, but also I think he was failed more by society as a whole than he was by Elphaba specifically. Second, she does not have any kind of solidarity with the TikTok creatures. This is genuinely bad. They are an oppressed group, and she does not seem to recognize it. From her perspective, though, it makes some sense. She never meets a TikTok creature that is able to express its own autonomy. She isn't there for either of the examples I mentioned earlier, so it is somewhat understandable that she would not understand that they are sentient. That being said, it would still be better if she had recognized it on her own. The point I want to make, though, is that this shouldn't matter as much as it does. Our society refuses to have solidarity or even compassion for people that we don't view as perfect victims. As soon as a victim does something wrong, we stop caring about what is done to them. And I think this attitude of disliking book Elphaba kind of comes from this. In the films, Elphaba is a perfect victim. I don't think she ever does anything wrong. This is not, however, realistic. We all make mistakes, none of us are perfect, and we need to be able to have solidarity with each other anyway, to understand that we can all be victims and we can all be perpetrators. We need to stop looking for perfect victims. To close out this video, I want to talk about the very end of the book. The book ends with the last lines of a story that Sarima tells her children about the Cumbric Witch. The story, and the book, end with the following lines. And there the wicked old witch stayed for a good long time. And did she ever come out? Not yet. Many take this to mean that Elphaba is going to return. After all, her namesake, Saint Elphaba, was said to have passed through a waterfall in another symbolic baptism and returned years and years later. I disagree with this interpretation, though. The point, I think, is that Elphaba's legacy is not over. She is just one bearer of the legacy of Lilith. The story does not begin, nor does it end, with Elphaba. Soon enough, another will come to take her place. This won't happen naturally, though. someone needs to choose to take her place. More than that, we all need to take her place. No one person can fight this alone, but together, we all can. We can all pick up the torch, or perhaps the broom that she left behind, and fight like hell. Thanks for watching.
RTR, fuck me hard.